Hello, so we're here with Professor Harry de Gorter from Cornell University. He's an expert on world trade and trade issues, particularly dealing with agriculture. So, welcome.
Thank you.
Harry, how do countries benefit from trade?
Countries benefit from trade by comparative advantage, taking advantage of comparative advantage where they have more resources, more specialized in technology, labor, human capital, and they get economic growth from that. So a poor country and a rich country can trade with each other, and both countries benefit, even though one country might have higher costs in both products.
So for example, if I've got cheap labor and you've got cheap materials, we can trade and make goods together and both be better off.
Exactly.
Okay.
The other benefits from trade is, of course, the dynamic benefits that you have more competition, that you have to adopt new technologies, new managerial techniques, you get more foreign investment or even domestic investment, and you get better political credibility. Once you sign a trade agreement, a free trade agreement, industry knows that you're committed to that, and so investment occurs. And small countries can benefit from economies of scale. So there's a lot of dynamic benefits from trade, not just this comparative advantage benefit.
Okay. And so if countries benefit from trade and having sort of free trade one with another, why do some countries try to put up trade barriers? In fact, all countries.
Well, first of all, the social acceptance is that exports are good, imports are bad. That's what everybody thinks. And so to maximize votes, politicians put trade barriers for those industries that would lose from free trade. Lobbyists lobby and give political money. And sometimes governments also put trade barriers up to discipline other countries so that they can get freer trade in other sectors, especially large countries against small countries. Yes.
So if we go back to our trade example where I've got labor and you've got the materials, labor in your country might want the trade barrier so they can keep their wages high.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So talk to me about how we regulate trade. We know about the World Trade Organization, but what does it do and how does it regulate trade?
Well, the World Trade Organization has trade agreements from historical negotiating rounds, and they administer those agreements. They have a trade dispute mechanism. If some countries are subsidizing production or exports, or they are discriminating against one country over another, they have a whole set of rules to make sure that countries don't do that. And if they do, they have a trade dispute and they settle it.
And how does that settling process work?
Well,
is this like a court?
Yes, it is exactly like a court. There's a process of, like a court, it has to have some, has to make sense to get through the first stage, but exactly right, it's a court. And they use basic principles of the WTO, which are non-discrimination. You can't discriminate. Trade barriers cannot discriminate between your one country over another. You have national treatment. You can't discriminate over imports versus your domestic product, and various rules like that.
And so the country that enters the WTO, you're sort of agreeing to this,
exactly.
This process. What portion of trade goes through WTO countries? I mean, what countries are involved?
Oh, there's 159 countries part of the WTO. Russia's just recently joined, so most countries are now going through the WTO. The other way the WTO liberalized trade is through accession. You have to join the club, like China had to join the club in 2000, and through the process of joining the WTO, the EU and the United States in particular forced China to reduce their trade barriers substantially. China reduced their trade barriers more in 10 years than the United States and Europe did in 50 years. So that was one of the biggest accomplishments of the WTO. It was not a trade dispute or a trade negotiating, but an accession agreement.
But so the WTO sets up rules that sort of govern trade.
Mm-hmm.
But then if I as a country want to set up a trade barrier, I still have some options to try and do that. It's just I'm limited. right?
That's correct. That's correct. There's lots of situations where you're allowed to have a trade barrier if it is involved with the environment. For example, there's escape clauses that you're allowed to put a trade barrier up, or a labeling agreement, whatever, if some public good is being hurt, like turtles. Somebody's destroying the turtles, which is a common resource to the world, you can put up barriers.
So what does this have to do with GMOs? How do GMOs play into this and the potential for trade barriers?
Well, the European Union has very different regulations on GMOs than the United States and Canada, and so they delayed the process. They put a moratorium on GMOs, and then all of a sudden WTO principles kick in. For example, the key thing about a WTO law or rule on discrimination or national treatment is that you cannot put a trade barrier on a like product. So a GMO soybean and a soybean are identical products, and the WTO does not like any barriers due to process and production methods. And so the GMOs are looked like as a way in which you produce a soybean, but a soybean is a soybean. And so that's when you have problems in the WTO, when you have different regulatory barriers on the use and importation and regulations on allowing GMOs to be grown in a particular country.
So does that mean you can't set up a trade barrier based on GMOs at all?
Well, they had a trade agreement. They had a trade dispute in 2003. The United States was the lead, Canada against the European Union on exactly that. And the WTO panel ruled that the EU was out of line. And it got to a point where the EU said they would lift the moratorium, and they did. But the regulations were such that they still didn't conform to non-discrimination, national treatment, and so the United States was allowed to punish the EU by putting 100% tariffs on select EU products. This was averted again later so that they got to some compromise.
So is there any exception to these WTO rules if, for example, you can make the argument that GMOs are unsafe?
Well, there's several articles in the WTO that the GMOs would fall under. One of them would be the sanitary and phytosanitary, which is all about food safety, but they require the scientific method. You have to prove that through science that there's some safety issue. Okay. And of course, they can't find that. The other one is the technical barriers to trade article, which rules on labeling. And they said you can't label GMOs unless, because it's a restrictive trade barrier, because there's no real reason to say that one is worse than the other.
Okay, and so if we have these trade barriers in place for the time period that they were, and it sounds like they still are
to some degree, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. So if we have those trade barriers, how does that affect farmers?
Well. Which farmers? I guess that's the key point. It affects farmers in the United States because they get closed out of markets for corn. Even in China now, China doesn't like GMO corn, so we've been shut out of corn. No trade disputes, but threats of trade disputes. So it affects farmers in the United States that export GMO products, but it also affects consumers worldwide. We have less supply and higher prices for food grains, oilseeds, because of countries not allowing it to be produced.
So just having the barrier there.
Yes.
Suddenly the consumers have to pay more for their food.
Exactly.
Farmers, at least that are trying to export this, are worse off. They can't send it out. How about the farmers in the EU?
Well, insofar as they get a higher price advantage, they're better off.
Okay. So finally, I wanted to ask you a little bit about trade with Brazil and GMOs. I wonder if you have, I really don't know exactly how I want to ask this question. But so what do you know about GMOs in Brazil and trade and what's happened there?
Well, right now Brazil is one of the largest exporters of GMO corn and soybeans, but up until 2005, they themselves had a moratorium on GMOs, and the judiciary system in Brazil did not allow its production, and hence its trade.
Why the flip-flop?
Well, the farmers and the scientific community wanted it, but for some reason the policies were such that they disallowed it. But by 2005, then Brazil started a lot of production and export of GMO products. But in the meantime, the National Research Institute, which is a national body that funds agricultural research, and a lot of it is crops, had done all the research and developed expertise to do transgenic plant breeding. And by 2005 they began, and now they have a tremendous number of products, GMO products for different crops, for different conditions. And what you got to remember, GMOs, which this course is about, is it varies by region how you can have different characteristics, like fungi is a big problem in Brazil, so they've developed means to deal with that. That's not an issue, say, in the United States. So they have now a tremendous infrastructure of research and producing products, a good number of GMO products, not just corn and soybeans.
And who are they trading with?
Any country that will trade with them. China.
So China's taking their GMOs?
Oh, in agriculture in the last 15, 20 years, the biggest source of trade has been South-South trade between poor countries themselves. So they're exporting to Asia, and Europe is not that important for the basic commodities.
So is Europe not a trading partner because of their resistance to GMOs?
Well, first of all, as you know, GMOs only are relevant to a handful of crops. You know, cotton, corn, soybeans. There's no GMOs yet that I'm aware of in trade for wheat, say.
Yeah.
So in Europe right now, some countries are allowed to import GMOs within Europe, and some countries in Europe are allowed to grow GMO crops. They don't have a uniform policy for all of Europe. So trade is not completely cut off in those specific products as a result.
So
right now, recently, that's how has it evolved.
So to have the impact of a trade barrier, do you have to have a formal trade barrier, or can you?
That I don't know the answer to that, but yeah, if Spain is importing GMO corn, you'd think that markets would equilibrate within Europe so that in the long run it wouldn't have much of a market effect. I haven't researched that, so I don't know if that's happening. But that's evolved since this WTO dispute in the early 2000s.
Oh, so there's a recent
Yeah.
event. Yeah. Very good. So Harry, how do trade issues affect the market for GMOs?
Well, certainly in the beginning, when GMO crops got commercialized in a major way in 1998, it had a big impact on prices that, say, Brazilian producers who were not allowed to export and weren't allowed to plant it, reduced the supply of corn and soybeans on the world market, and therefore raised the price to the U.S. farmers who are allowed to produce and plant these products. But on the other hand, the U.S. farmers who were exporting these products had limited markets who banned it. So who knows what the net effect is? But those are the kind of effects you got to look at to see. On the one hand, we have lower supply because some countries aren't allowed to use it. On the other hand, those countries that are allowed to produce GMO products get smaller markets.
So what is a GMO?
Well, it's a genetically modified organism. The first GMO was for tomatoes.
Okay.
It was commercialized, the McGregor tomato, and what they did was they used technology that was done in medicine. They turned off a gene. And by doing so, you could pick a tomato in California that was ripe and would come here ripe rather than green and yellow.
Yeah.
And so what you're doing is you're changing the genetic makeup of a particular crop, a seed, that has characteristics like for the tomato, like for corn, it's for drought resistance, it's for, well, they're developing drought resistance right now, but the initial ones were to be able to overcome rust, disease problems. just like in cotton.
So are they safe?
Well, I'm not a scientist. I'm an economist.
Are they safe for the economy then?
The scientific community unequivocally say they're safe. There's a whole list of international bodies, including the European Research Institute on plants, that it is totally safe. There is no major research institute of any sort, university, government agency, or international agency, that has declared otherwise. There's like 20 that say it's completely safe.
So if you could tell the world one thing about GMOs, here's your chance. What is it?
Well, GMOs have done basically, they have, like let's just take cotton as an example. They have reduced the requirement for the use of pesticides. It saved many, many lives in China and India that use BT cotton, because you reduce the use of pesticides, you increase the yield per acre, you increase costs slightly, but profits go up on average for cotton 66% to poor farmers. So if you improve the environment, you improve the safety of the workers, you increase the profits of poor farmers, and you reduce the price, increase supplies and reduce the prices for consumers, BT cotton or other GMOs, you're reducing the problem of use of inputs, nitrogen. They're working on nitrogen fixation in Brazil right now. You have less water pollution. We have climate change happening. We have 9 billion people on the earth in 2050. We have scarce resources, land and water. We have to learn how to increase yields, reduce the use of resources, and GMOs is the most promising way to overcome those issues and achieve our goals as a society worldwide.
Great. Thank you very much, Harry.
Okay.